It's giving conservatives ammunition against environmentalism because it suggests that our true motives are destroying human civilization. So virtually all of us, at least those of us watching videos like this, we care about the environment, we want to do our part, and it's very common now for companies, even mainstream companies, to claim that their product is good or better for the environment. But unfortunately, there is a lot of misinformation surrounding environmentalism and just not a whole lot of evidence. Even experts, even people who study this sort of stuff for a living, can lead us astray. This infographic is a really good example. It's a visual representation of the climate mitigation gap. It's a paper by Seth Wines and Kimberly Nicholas. And it's a mix of actual science with uncritical claims using bad methodology. Because the falsehoods here are so extreme, the chart ends up being like 90% wrong, which sucks for those of us who really care and we want to do our part for the environment and we want to actually be effective. Unfortunately, people really don't know how to be effective. They really don't know what does and doesn't benefit the environment. Just look at the respondents' perception of eliminating plastic bags versus the actual environmental effect of removing bags. Yes, those studies proving, quote unquote, that reusable bags are worse than plastic are pretty absurd. They assume that you will like reuse these easily torn plastic bags many times and then use them as like trash bags after they're shredded. I don't think that's reasonable. But still, plastic bags are very lightweight. They make up a relatively small percentage of packaging. Eliminating them will have little impact on the environment. So where is this huge gap coming from? This gap between belief and reality surrounding environmental impact? I think a lot of it is wishful thinking, right? But a fair amount is also just bad science being picked up and promoted by journalists who don't know how to look at stuff critically. And so you end up with infographics like this, promoting having less kids to fight climate change, then being regurgitated by articles like this, devoid of virtually any practical criticism. There's just one line at the end with no explanation of how this line makes the entire point of the article and the study it's referencing irrelevant. The climate crisis is right now. We'll either have figured shit out in 100 years, meaning people will be living sustainably, or we'll be screwed way before that. The lifetime emissions of our grandchildren just don't matter. And that's accepting the flawed methodology of the study. So let's look at the study this all stems from. All they did was assume current average emissions and assigned 50% of each of your children's lifetime emissions to you, and then 25% of grandchildren, 12.5% of great-grandchildren, and so on, divided by your lifetime. The first problem is that they tried to account for genetic contribution, but didn't even attempt to account for environmental contribution. They only say it'll change if national emissions drop, but that is not nearly enough. If we do what we can to reduce our footprint, let's say by 75%, so like eating plant-based, limiting driving, doing what we can to be energy efficient at home, do we really think that our children have a 0% chance of following in our footsteps? So they have a 100% chance of just living like a typical consumer? It's a really serious confounding variable, and one that could definitely outpace genetic contribution. For example, if you have one environmentally conscious parent instilling those values, even if it means the child reduces his or her footprint by only 51% relative to the norm, you end up with negative emissions because the 51% reduction is larger than the 50% contribution of DNA. Let's say that the kid ends up having the same 75% reduction as the parent. Well, then that assumption flips it from being 50 tons CO2 equivalent a year from having one more child to being negative 25 tons CO2 equivalent per child. The parent's contribution is then a net sequestration. So the argument would then be have as many children as possible as long as you reduce your own footprint by more than 50%. Even if we reduced by a mere 51%, having children would still be net green, assuming that they follow in our footsteps. Obviously, there are a lot of unknowns here. Obviously, everything I said was based on assumptions. But once we reach adulthood, we tend to hold similar values as our parents. A kid growing up in an environmentally conscious home is more likely to grow up to be environmentally conscious themselves. And just a little aside, it's not clear-cut, like here's the genetic contribution and here's the environmental contribution. Clearly, genetics plays a role in the environmental contribution as well. It's not actually clear how much parental involvement actually plays a role. By that I mean, are we environmentally conscious because our parents actively taught us those values? Or are we environmentally conscious because our parents were genetically predisposed to be environmentally conscious, and so we are genetically predisposed to be environmentally conscious? Obviously, some combination of the two, but twin studies suggest that genetics play a larger role than we would like. Regardless, ignoring the potential massive difference between the influence of an environmental parent and like a typical parent is a huge oversight. The second and even larger problem with this study is that they ignore non-replacement rate reproduction. Each fewer person means there is a void that needs to be filled through incentivizing people to reproduce more or immigration. There's nothing wrong with immigration, but moving from a poor country to a wealthier one can mean from around 10 times the emissions to up to 100 or more when comparing the richest to the poorest. So obviously this is yet another huge confounding variable. Declining populations are a huge problem for economies and supporting the older generation with entitlement programs. Japan and China are suffering some from these issues now, and it's likely to get worse before it gets better. A very gradual decline in population can be sustainable for a while, but we're already on a dangerous trajectory here in the developed world. There's no reason to think it's going to be perfectly one-to-one, but it's entirely plausible that for every kid an environmentalist passes on, decides not to have, there's a 50, 75, or even a 99% chance of that space being filled by another, and it's very unlikely to be filled by another environmentalist. So without knowing how all of these confounding forces play out, you can't claim that skipping a kid results in these kinds of reductions. If we were on a growth track, that might be a credible claim, but not when our reproduction rates are already declining. If there's a 99% chance of that spot being filled anyway if you don't have a kid, it's not 50 tons, it's half a ton. If there's a 99% chance of that spot being filled by an average consumer, then we're leaving it up to conservatives to fill out the population. You could be looking at a harm of 50 tons per year from not having a child. And that doesn't even consider the systemic harms from conservatives gaining in voting power and overturning environmental initiatives. Beyond the unscientific nature of this sort of claim, it just looks bad. The optics are bad. This is as factually correct as saying that if you kill yourself right now, you will achieve the biggest possible CO2 saving. Needless to say, including this lever in the infographic is a very dumb idea because it creates a backlash and destroys good intentions. Aside from it like not actually being factually anything, yeah, it's terrible advocacy. It's giving conservatives ammunition against environmentalism because it suggests that our true motives are destroying human civilization, which I don't think is true for most environmentalists. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, that was their most high impact personal choice we can make to mitigate our contribution to climate change. Unfortunately, the second option isn't much better. Biking everywhere, because everyone knows that bikes are fueled by magic. The benefit of bike riding depends entirely on the fuel. You are the engine and the food you eat is the gas. The average person can burn 50 to 75 calories per mile, and the average round-trip commute is 30 miles a day. So that's 1,500 to 2,225 calories every workday. Now, food production accounts for a quarter of emissions globally, 3 tons CO2 equivalent per person. If a bike saves you 2.5 tons, as the infographic implies, but then you produce an extra 3 tons, yeah, the math doesn't really work out in favor of biking. You'd probably be better off sticking with your car if you're not vegan or mostly vegan. If you are vegan, then biking can save you a little because doubling your food is not going to have the same impact, right? It is actually greener than running a car on gas, but an electric vehicle is still going to be the way to go due to the inherent emissions, even from plant foods. Food as produced, packaged, and distributed is just not an efficient fuel source, which is why there's no such thing as an athletic environmentalist. That's a joke. Obviously, there's public transit, and that's great if it's done right. It depends, right? Is the infrastructure actually sustainable, and is it actually used? I mean, a mostly empty bus is way worse environmentally than a car. There are also issues of reliability. There's the last mile issue, as it's known, which makes it really hard for a lot of people to actually utilize public transport. Many people just can't afford to risk missing work or being substantially late to work. And sometimes there literally are not enough hours in the day to use public transit if you like sleeping. I feel like beyond not having any concept of thermodynamics, the people who tell others to just drop cars like it's no big thing have never actually had to commute to work or have done so in like the few cities where it's actually viable. I used to bike to college a few days a week until I stopped because it was awful. It took a long time and it was actually pretty scary. It was about 40 minutes just to get there and no bike lanes. Ultimately, this is an issue of public policy more than individual responsibility. The third high impact option, avoiding transatlantic flights, sure, but they might as well have put like avoid trips to the moon for as much as like your average person takes intercontinental flights. It's almost like they stuck the worst possible flight on there so they could have a bare bar relative to the other options so they could feel good about not doing something that they already weren't doing. Point is, your more realistic average flight falls well under the savings you get from eating a plant-based diet. For instance, in the US, average daily airborne hours, 9.5 hours, and departures per aircraft, 3.78. So 9.5 hours divided by 3.78 departures equals 2.51 hours. That's less than half of the duration of the shortest transatlantic flights from New York to London. This doesn't mean that flying is innocuous, of course not, but it should put into perspective just how important avoiding animal products is for the average person relative to these other high impact options. The fourth one, to buy green energy, is highly suspect. What we're basically talking about are clean energy credits, and there are several problems with this. Returns depend on the alternative power source where you live, and these tend to be post hoc, right? After government or industry has built a renewable power source, they can sell off the credits. So it doesn't necessarily mean more will be built. They're also usually in short supply, so providing they're all bought, it doesn't really have much of an effect if you buy them or not. That makes it more of a policy issue than an individual consumer issue. Some renewables can also increase reliance on fossil fuels due to intermittency issues. We're not buying into something that can currently provide reliable baseline power on the grid, so the total numbers can be misleading. A Kickstarter for renewables, where you'd buy the credits before the fact, could be more useful. This kind of thing does exist, but it's not without risk. The credits you're buying are projections, often highly optimistic, even unrealistic. They're created with a bias towards selling more credits to raise more money, so they might not ever come to fruition or be as advertised if they do. Much like kickstarting, say, a video game. George Monbiot has a pretty good older article in The Guardian about buying indulgences when it comes to climate change. There's a lot to consider and not a lot of evidence. I'm not saying that buying credits is a bad thing. I think offsetting can be very important if you can't otherwise make any changes. I've talked about this before when it comes to being vegan, right? If you can't be vegan, then it makes sense to donate some of your money to effective farm animal charities. But it can be a bad thing if you use it as an excuse not to reduce the primary source of damage. Buying green energy is overstated here in terms of magnitude and certainty, and it makes real actions like avoiding animal products look less meaningful by comparison. It may cause real harm if people opt for paying for indulgences instead of doing the real work of reducing their impact. Most of the rest here is pretty good, pretty solid, but that's also because it's based on like easily measurable quantities of energy, right? Like how much it takes to heat water. Interesting, they didn't include showers, taking shorter showers, or even taking cold showers, since a shower uses a lot more hot water than a washing machine. Maybe they thought it would be a non-starter for people, which, fair, except their number one high impact option is having less kids. So telling people to take cold showers is too far, but telling them to have less children, totally fine. Makes sense. It's also completely missing general home energy efficiency stuff, like upgrading insulation, using HE appliances. That's pretty weird. The final thing I want to talk about here is recycling, because it's complicated. When China stopped taking our recycling, this caused a huge upset in plastics recycling. Plastic is something that really should be recycled to save energy, but unfortunately, when it comes to actually making that happen, we're at the whim of policy and technology. Current efforts just might not be terribly useful. But the good news is industry is feeling the pressure. There's hope this could start to change soon as they invest in new technologies. You've got major companies like Unilever making major investments and commitments to increase recycled content. Of course, Greenpeace doesn't like it. They call it greenwashing for PR, but there's no real credible explanation for why this is beyond them calling it insincere and claiming the technology is unproven. The truth is there's a lot of really compelling research in this area, both in studying new plastics that are easier to recycle and in creating new processes such as enzymatic depolymerization to recycle existing ones. Skepticism of the industry's motivation is reasonable, but more recycled plastic is more recycled plastic. It doesn't matter if they genuinely want to do good or if they just want to sell more product and avoid taxes. More recycled plastic is more recycled plastic. The point is, for a lot of this, we're just going to have to kind of wait for innovation, basically, and policy change as well, and just try not to make things worse in the meantime. Do our best to reduce our footprint in the meantime. In terms of recycling plastic, the best we can do for now is follow local recycling guidelines, being really careful to clean containers and only recycle what we are allowed to recycle. If you're unsure, it is much better to just throw it away. Now, glass offers modest energy savings in terms of the furnace temperature requirement, but the main savings are emissions from carbonates that release CO2 when they're melted with sand to make virgin glass. Unfortunately, without an industry-wide carbon tax, there's little incentive to optimize the waste stream, particularly when transporting glass cullet from recycling to manufacturing facilities is cost prohibitive. Much of Europe has already figured this out, but here in the US, it is very likely that your recycled glass is going straight to the landfill. Paper may be an even worse case. Some argue that it shouldn't be recycled at all because the energy to do it actually emits more carbon than just manufacturing virgin paper. There is more water pollution from making virgin paper, but that's more of a local issue, so it's not clear. We're talking about global climate change, global emissions, so it's not clear exactly how that factors in. Of course, it's worse for it to go in the garbage where it may end up producing methane in a landfill, but sometimes incinerating garbage for fuel just makes more sense. Metal, steel, and aluminum, recycle those. It's pretty much the only uncontroversial, recycle it. So yes, we should recycle even paper because it's probably slightly beneficial. And if everybody really got on top of it and started recycling appropriately, not throwing food in recycling bins or plastic bags, we could actually fix our waste streams and see some serious savings. Shut up, stomach. Yes, I'm hungry. Stop. Seriously, if you recycle and you haven't read up on your local rules, your local guidelines, please do so. There is a very good chance that you are recycling things that shouldn't be recycled, and you could actually be doing more harm than good. But even if you're recycling correctly, at least here in the US, we are dealing with systemic issues that are hard to fight without governmental policy changes. Again, a lot of this has to do with institutional change, not so much individual change. It would make more sense to buy products that say they are, the packaging is made with some high percentage of recycled material. This tells the industry that there is demand for this. And as I mentioned, this may become more common in the coming years, but unfortunately right now there's no equivalent of like a nutrition facts that's required on food. There's no sort of nutrition facts for like plastic packaging. And so not many products advertise their packaging and what their packaging is actually made of. So as consumers, not having that information, there's just not a whole lot we can do sometimes. And finally, of course, reuse products wherever you can and reduce consumption in the first place. There's a reason the saying is reduce, reuse, recycle, right? Recycling is the last resort, so to speak. So in conclusion, there are really only a few significant changes we can make to significantly reduce our impact. Number one would be go vegan or mostly vegan. Most people can significantly reduce their animal product consumption, at least most of you watching this video, right? Say no to airplanes if you can. Obviously, some people can't do that. They have to rely on them for work. Drive an electric vehicle, again, if you can. Not everyone can afford that, at least yet. And just as a little tip, check your local rules, your local guidelines. There might be a rebate. Here in Oregon, we have the charge ahead rebate. You get $2,500 back depending on, there are some rules, depends on the car you buy. And I think it depends on your income as well. Maybe there are lots of different stipulations, but you could get some money back if you choose to buy an electric car. Finally, optimize your home energy efficiency. Again, if you're privileged enough to actually have a home and disposable income to improve it, because it's not exactly cheap. If you do all of the other things like avoiding plastic packaging and recycling and washing in cold water, this helps, every little bit helps, but it doesn't compare to the other four. Arguably the easiest thing though, and very important if you live in a swing state or even a swing district, vote for Democrats. They are much less bad than Republicans when it comes to environmental initiatives and whatnot, and they're the only alternative that can actually be elected right now. Unfortunately, the Greens, even if they were electable, kind of epitomize all of the nonsense I talked about in this video, which is the big issue here. We are surrounded by misinformation on environmentalism, often from the very people who are supposed to be experts on environmentalism. But hopefully this video helped you feel not so bad about the stupid things that we can't do and to focus our efforts where it matters most. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this. If you did, give it a like. Consider subscribing as well. You can also support the channel, patreon.com/unnaturalvegan. And I will have a new video hopefully very soon. Oh, baby! My family budget video monetized insanely well. That might be the best monetized video, like money per view, that I've ever had ever. So that's amazing. That makes me so happy. I really enjoyed doing that. I hope that was actually useful for people. It took quite a bit of work. I mean, not really. It was just mostly cooking, which I'd be doing anyway. Not that much cooking, but it still led to food that we could eat. And we ended up spending less on food than we would normally spend. So that's pretty cool. I saved money for the video and then also made more money in terms of per view than I would normally make on a video. So hey, that's pretty exciting. And like I said, I genuinely enjoy doing it, and I hope that I don't know, I've read some comments that people were like, yes, thank you. This is what I've wanted. So yeah. All right. That's it. Feeling good. More recycled plastic is more recycled plastic. It's kind of like that Taylor Swift song. It was very pro LGBTQ and all of that stuff. And so much of the discussion was about whether it was legit or not, or it was just this corporate effort. And yeah, okay, I get it, but who gives a shit? Isn't this great that this is in a popular mainstream song? Whether we like it or not, people are influenced by commercials. They're influenced by Taylor Swift. They're influenced by pop stars. So it really does matter for people when they hear their favorite singer saying, yeah, gay people are pretty all right. It matters to people, whether we like it or not. Dun dun dun. What is it? What could it be? It's just a shirt replacement. Because I somehow ruined my other one. So yeah, can finally wear my shirt again. Ooh, I can't wait to rip this off. Ooh, it's so exciting. Ooh, wait. I don't know. Should I do it? Yeah. Oh. Anyway, I have a couple shirts, for those who don't know, designed by partner. So cute.